Hi, Nancy Shanto, and I'm going to read to you today from Access to Power, a radical approach for changing your life. This is a section called Colonialism and Hegemony, and I am doing a second part on cultural appropriation because I got a question about it, and I felt like the first video I made really addressed cultural appropriation itself, but didn't really answer the question, which was when a marginalized culture um, takes or appropriates from mainstream culture, is that a problem the way that cultural appropriation the other way is a problem? And I hinted at the answer, but I didn't actually address it directly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read Colonialism and Hegemony, this sidebar from the culture chapter in the book, and this is something I wrote, and then I will talk to you a little bit more about cultural appropriation from the other direction. This is called Colonialism and Hegemony. Nestled in Nevada County, one of the whitest counties in California, Skills for Change collective members and coaches are among the few who bring up the subjects of colonialism and hegemony in our community. Whether or not we are aware of it, the underlying basis of colonialism lives in our bodies, language, beliefs, internalized oppression, and access to power. Colonialism is the centuries-long process by which mostly Western European countries have quote-unquote discovered, immigrated into, dominated, subjugated, assimilated, genocided, and destroyed existing cultures and peoples, and replaced them with a mini-me replica of the mother country's mores, ethics, language, beliefs, and power structures. Hegemony is an underlying threat of violence that keeps the status quo of patriarchy, white supremacy, and Christian-centric cultural dominance intact worldwide. Look at the countries with the biggest militaries, and you'll find the elite of the hegemony. When people who are privileged by the history of colonialism and hegemony interact with people who are oppressed by the history of colonialism and hegemony, very often there is a one-up, one-down power dynamic that goes unmentioned. One-down or oppressed people tend not to mention their feelings of oppression unless they feel safe, and one-up or privileged people tend not to notice and or deny that underlying dynamics exist. As Skills for Change practitioners, we name power and make it visible to all. We identify power inequities, attempt to balance them whenever possible, and advocate for everyone's rights to safe transactions, spaces, and communities. Often folks in the middle class in the United States are both oppressed and oppressors, and how we identify tends to depend on the particular transaction we have just experienced. While this basic act of naming power can seem awkward, often it is accompanied by a sense of relief by the parties who are one down. When I'm working with someone who has a vastly different cultural background, I might say something like this. I want to acknowledge that we have really different backgrounds, histories, cultures, and upbringings, and have been affected by those experiences in ways that privilege and oppress us. I can see some ways we are different and imagine there are others that are invisible to me. I am committed to naming them as they arise and dealing with any power imbalances as they come up between us. I hope you will trust me if you feel unsafe at any time by letting me know what you are feeling, and I promise to share what I feel and see also. I might then give some examples of the power I hold, the privilege of being the coach, a woman who has verbal and emotional intelligence, the power of nurturing, the privilege of white skin color. English as a first language, education, an able body, heterosexuality, and so on. I want you to know that I consider it my responsibility to educate myself about power differences, and if there's a book, movie, or other reference that you think would help me understand you better, I'd be happy to read, watch, listen, and so on. If clients then want to explore their own privilege and oppression and how the differences between us could impact our work together, I consider that conversation to be incredibly valuable to the work we will do as coach and client. Fundamentally, it is not helpful, though it is incredibly normal, to feel ashamed of privilege and oppression, one-up and one-down status. A bury our heads in the sand ostrich approach to privilege and oppression does not make them go away, and we miss the opportunity to align our strengths with our vision for the future. Ideally, each of us will understand and check our privilege to ensure we don't abuse it, honor the history and experiences of others, and work together to create a world where everyone's contributions are valued. Okay, So how does colonialism and hegemony apply to cultural appropriation? And I did speak in the other video about when somebody from the mainstream culture takes somebody from a marginalized community's culture without understanding the context. And if you want more on that, I would refer you to the other video. This is much more about what happens when somebody from a marginalized community, and I think the example in this case was somebody from indigenous, you know, American, U.S. indigenous tribal peoples singing Amazing Grace. What happens in that situation? And I just want to say that those people are First Peoples, right? That they have oftentimes tribal rights to the land, and that there were treaties made that have been broken, that their communities and people were genocided, and that when we honor treaties with those peoples, that they are sovereign. They have sovereign national status. So that means they're countries inside countries, right? Okay. So what happens in that case is that there is a relationship between cultures that's happening, an exchange, a cultural exchange. The power dynamic is not, the mainstream culture isn't hurt by the exchange of cultural tradition. There isn't any harm done to some sort of mainstream representative of Amazing Grace unless it's a copyrighted um, form, a copyrighted cultural artifact. There isn't any harm done to that mainstream cultural entity. So there's no transactional impact in terms of somebody feeling one down based on that transaction. Oftentimes, it's a complex expression of creativity, and people will have varying different reactions to it. Some people very positive, some people very moved, some people negative, some people neutral. So, but the critical thing is that transactionally, there hasn't been any harm done. Now, if some, in copyright situations, if somebody's creative artifact that is copyrighted and protected was taken by somebody else and used, that obviously becomes a legal issue. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about things that are, copyrights expired, or things that are just familiar from mainstream culture. So we're really looking at, in a transaction, we're looking at power, and we're looking at effect, power, the effect of power. And if somebody is harmed by the taking of a cultural artifact, then we want to address that. And I didn't mention it in the last video, but the people who are taking also get a self-esteem benefit. And that's pretty profound. Because if you're feeling better when you culturally appropriate from somebody because you've just won, or you're the victor in some way, or what even is that about? That's a problem too. So, if the power dynamics shift and all of a sudden that mainstream cultural product is now the product of oppression instead of the product of privilege, I'm sure we would be reanalyzing the situation. We're often needing to look at things in context. But in this particular context, I would say no harm, no foul. Okay. Cultural Appropriation Part 2. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them in the best way I can.